They planted 800 trees on top of one of the most important archaeological sites in human history to stop anyone from digging deeper. Göbekli Tepe sits beneath the Turkish soil, 90% unexcavated, holding secrets from more than 11,000 years ago. And someone decided the world isn't ready to know what's buried out there.
When you're talking about Göbekli Tepe, one of the things that Jimmy Corsetti has talked about recently in his YouTube show is that they have stopped excavation and they've planted trees above some of the areas, which is very strange.
It is, yeah.
And they want the excavation to resume in 150 years?
Yes.
So what would be a logical reason to not excavate these fascinating ancient sites that are at least 11,000 years old?
Generally, with any archaeological site, they don't excavate more than 5% of it, and often less than 2% of it.
Is that because of funds?
It's often because of funds, but it's also because of the feeling that as technology improves, more may be learnt from these sites in the future. And that's a reasonable argument, because excavation is destruction. To a certain extent, excavation destroys what's being excavated. And therefore, when you interfere with a site and start excavating it, you may be destroying materials that in 100 years, technology would be able to interpret in a completely different way. I mean, go back 100 years from where we are at present, and you didn't have carbon dating, you didn't have LiDAR, you didn't have the luminescence from rocks is another way of dating. We didn't have any of those technologies. We do have them now. And so I think the speculation is 100 years in the future, archaeologists may have technologies that would be able to extract more information than this. That's the case that's made. I get it. But I think Göbekli Tepe is such an important site, and I know for sure, because I spent 3 days with Klaus Schmidt, who was the original excavator of Göbekli Tepe, that underneath that place there are dozens of huge unexcavated stone circles with enormous megalithic pillars in them, all under the ground, waiting to be excavated. And the decision appears to have been made not to excavate them. And I do find that slightly suspicious. I do find it odd. I think the site has got such an important role. It's such an iconic site that to just stop the excavation or to only continue it in a very small way isn't satisfactory.
To understand what's happening at Göbekli Tepe, you need to understand what this place actually is. In 1963, an American archaeological survey noticed something odd on a hillside in southeastern Turkey. Fragments of worked stone scattered across a mound locals called Potbelly Hill. They assumed it was a Byzantine cemetery. Nothing special. They moved on. 30 years later, Klaus Schmidt saw those same stones, but Schmidt had just excavated Nevelachori, another impossibly old site nearby, and he recognized what others had missed. These weren't grave markers. They were the tips of megaliths. What Schmidt uncovered defied every timeline we had. Stone circles 20 feet across, pillars weighing up to 16 tons each, carved with foxes, vultures, scorpions, serpents, creatures rendered with stunning artistry by people who supposedly lived in caves. And here's where the mystery begins. Göbekli Tepe was built at least 9,600 BCE, during a period called the Pre-Pottery Neolithic. There was no pottery, no metal tools, no evidence of permanent settlement. Yet someone organized thousands of people to quarry, carve, transport, and build these monuments. Then, around 8,000 BCE, they buried it all, deliberately. You might think maybe nature did this, winds and time, slowly burying the stones. But no, the soil inside Göbekli Tepe isn't natural. It's filled with fragments of carved rock, flint tools, and the bones of ancient feasts, the debris of people, not of erosion. This wasn't an accident of time, it was a decision, and still unexplained. Schmidt spent 2 decades here, and he knew better than anyone. Less than 10% of Göbekli Tepe has been uncovered. Ground-penetrating radar reveals at least 20 more stone circles still buried below, along with deeper structures reaching nearly 30 meters into the earth. But in 2014, Schmidt died unexpectedly. He was only 61, and that's when things changed. Turkish authorities announced that future work would focus on conservation rather than discovery. Ground-penetrating radar showed at least 20 massive enclosures still underground, but excavation teams were told to stop expanding. Therefore, by 2020, archaeologists made it official. Large-scale digging at Göbekli Tepe would be postponed for 150 years. And then, the trees appeared. 800 olive trees, planted directly above buried structures. Their roots, archaeologists warned, would penetrate the ancient stone. making future excavation nearly impossible. Some of those trees were planted by landowners seeking government compensation, not by archaeologists. Therefore, in 2024, outcry forced the government to begin removing the trees. But the damage, many fear, had already been done.
When you say suspicious, like what would be the motivation for discontinuing that kind of excavation other than the fear of destroying things?
I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist.
Please do. Jump right in.
But there is an issue here. I've noticed that it isn't just attacks on me that certain archaeologists are making. It's also attacks on other specialists. For example, Dani Hilman Natawijaja, who is the geologist who brought to the world's attention the mystery of Gunung Padang in Indonesia, which appeared in the first episode of season 1 of Ancient Apocalypse. The possibility that this site is more than 27,000 years old, that we're looking at a pyramidal structure that has had several phases of work done on it, and that the earliest phases go back deep into the last ice age. He managed to publish a peer-reviewed paper on this, but unfortunately for Danny, he'd appeared on my show. And that led archaeologists to dive in on him, and there was a ganging up of archaeologists, and complaints were made to the peer-reviewed journal that published it, and finally they retracted his paper without any good reasons. It's like, we don't want too much attention brought to this. Let's crush it right now. The same thing is happening with the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis.
Attacking archaeologists who challenge the official narrative has become a familiar pattern, especially when discoveries threaten to rewrite history. Just look at what happened at Gunung Padang in Indonesia. Gunung Padang sits on the island of Java, a stepped pyramid sacred to locals who've held rituals there for centuries. On the surface, it looks ancient, maybe a few thousand years old, standard megalithic construction. But when geologist Dani Hilman Natawijaja drilled deeper, he found something else. Layers of worked stone descending 30 meters into the earth. Radiocarbon dates from organic material embedded in the structures suggested construction phases stretching back at least 27,000 years, even before the pyramids of Egypt were officially said to have been built, before Stonehenge, before civilization was supposed to exist. In October 2023, his peer-reviewed paper was published in Archaeological Prospection. The findings were extraordinary, but Natawijaja had appeared on Graham Hancock's show, and scrutiny came swiftly. Within months, complaints flooded the journal. Critics argued Natawijaja had dated soil, not artifacts, that his interpretations were speculative, that his claims contradicted established archaeological consensus. In March 2024, the journal retracted the paper, not because the data was fabricated, not because the methods were fundamentally flawed, but because the conclusions were too controversial. Because accepting them would require rewriting the story of human civilization. Natawijaja called it censorship, a silencing of inconvenient evidence. And he's not alone to question the official narrative, because 12,800 years ago, something catastrophic happened. Temperatures plunged. Ice sheets that had been retreating for millennia suddenly surged. Megafauna, mammoths, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, vanished across continents. The Clovis culture, one of North America's earliest widespread peoples, disappeared almost overnight. Mainstream archaeology attributes this to climate change, a natural cooling period called the Younger Dryas. But some researchers propose a different explanation. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests a fragmented comet exploded in Earth's atmosphere, triggering catastrophic wildfires, a brief impact winter, and rapid climate destabilization. Proponents point to a boundary layer found at dozens of sites worldwide, containing shocked quartz, magnetic spherules, melt glass, and platinum spikes, materials associated with cosmic impacts. Yet despite mounting evidence, studies published in peer-reviewed journals, reproducible findings from independent teams, the hypothesis faces relentless opposition. Papers are challenged, researchers attacked, fundings withdrawn. Experts suggest this resistance stems from paradigm inertia. The scientific establishment built its reputation on gradualism, the idea that change happens slowly, predictably. A cosmic catastrophe disrupts that narrative. Therefore, it must be resisted. But what if both Göbekli Tepe and the Younger Dryas impact are pieces of the same puzzle? What if 12,800 years ago, survivors of a global cataclysm gathered in southeastern Turkey and built something, not as a temple, but as a warning?
an enormous amount of attacks are being made on that hypothesis, rather than considering it as an interesting explanation for the cataclysms at the end of the Ice Age. A lot of people are just focused on trying to destroy it in every way possible. And I can't help wondering, maybe there's some truth, deep truth, to this, that there was a cataclysm, that there was an ancient apocalypse, something really horrific that happened. Maybe it's a cyclical disaster. Maybe it's coming round again. This is something that would lead any government to want to avoid panic, to suppress, to cover up these issues. So that would be the conspiracy theory on it. I'm not saying I buy it, but I'm saying that it's possible.
Would also a conspiracy be that they'd recognize that some of the area around Göbekli Tepe was older still, and they decided the archaeologists didn't want to confront it, and they put a stop to it?
That's also possible. But in their favor and to their credit, excavation of that whole area around, not Göbekli Tepe itself, but other neighboring sites, Karahan Tepe is the best known. Turkish archaeologists, it's interesting, are calling this now a civilization. They're calling it the Taş Tepeler civilization, the Stone Hills civilization. And they're finding that the same iconography, the same building techniques, not quite on the scale of Göbekli Tepe, are repeated all across the region. They extend all the way down to the south of the Jordan Valley, to Jericho. The ancient site of Jericho is part of that lost or emerging civilization that appeared at the end of the Younger Dryas.
Turkish researchers now refer to this as the Taş Tepeler, the Stone Hills civilization, a culture that emerged at the end of the Younger Dryas, spread across the Fertile Crescent, and then vanished. And here's what troubles Orthodox archaeology. This civilization predates agriculture. It predates metalworking, writing, the wheel. Yet the organizational complexity required to build these sites rivals anything in Egypt or Mesopotamia. Thousands of years later, some believe Göbekli Tepe was the birthplace of civilization, that the need to repeatedly gather here drove the invention of farming, animal domestication, and permanent settlement. Others suggest the opposite, that it was built by a civilization already ancient, survivors of a world that ended in fire and ice. There's a theory, whispered among researchers, never published, always dismissed, that Göbekli Tepe is a library, not of books or tablets, but of architecture. The symbols carved into its stones may form a language we've never learned to read, a record buried to outlast time itself. Some believe governments fear what might still lie below, discoveries that could point to cyclical cataclysms, cosmic events that return every 12,000 years. If humanity remembered what happened before, we might recognize the signs unfolding now. Because if a lost civilization once existed, we must face a far greater truth. Everything we've built could vanish. The Earth has reset before, and it could reset again. And if that's true, Göbekli Tepe isn't just an archaeological site. It's a message, left by the survivors of the last apocalypse, speaking to us across 11,000 years. This happened before. It will happen again. Don't forget. By late 2024, the Turkish government began relocating the trees. Archaeologists remain cautiously optimistic that the damage can be repaired, the excavations resumed, and the truth, whatever it is, finally brought to light. But only 10% of Göbekli Tepe has been uncovered. The other 90% still waits. The question isn't whether we should dig, it's whether we're ready for what we'll find. Because if Göbekli Tepe teaches us anything, it's this. Humanity has always been more than we think we are, capable of more, vulnerable to more, and bound to a past we're only beginning to remember. The story isn't over. Stay curious.